Hello and welcome to another One History Help video with me, Mrs. O'Neill. One History Help, the place for all your GCSE history revision needs and other revision advice and bits and bobs as well. Hope you're enjoying the One History Help videos. Today we are going to be looking at 1940s USA. Now, a lot of the previous GCSE syllabus that covered American history did not really include the 1940s, so for a lot of people this is going to be relatively new territory. It's really fascinating to see America's attitudes to World War II and the progress that America was able to make coming out of the Great Depression because of it. So let's get started. Remember, you need anything that, well, you feel you need in front of you. Something to write with, some highlighters, or maybe you're just going to sit, listen and take all of the knowledge in. Regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you find it useful. Here's a run through of what we're going to be covering today. As you can see, it takes us from before World War II begins and also out to the other side of it as well at the very end. Now, let me have a think. Yeah, I believe the only time we won't really be talking about World War II, but about the 1940s in general, is when we look at Black Americans on the home front and we look at some of the developments that happened in civil rights following on from World War II. But we're going to kick things off with America before World War II starts. So I'm sure many of you have watched the 1930s America video. If you haven't yet, you might find it useful to watch that before this, unless you are pretty confident with your knowledge on 1930s USA already. America is going into the 1940s in a really difficult position financially and economically in their country, but it's going to be a very, very different story when World War II and the 1940s comes to an end. If you take a second to look at these photographs here, you can kind of get the gist of the attitude that Americans had in 1939 and going into the 1940s as well when World War II began. As we're going to see, they very much did not want to get involved. But when we move on to point number 2 of our little contents page there, we will start to learn that they got to a point where they had very little choice in the matter. To understand America's attitude before World War II, we've got to go way back to pretty much the beginning of our study, really, in the aftermath of World War I. So since 1918, 1919, America had followed a policy of isolationism. They remained isolated and did not get involved in affairs outside of America. Now, some of you may well have studied the League of Nations before, and you will know that although America comes up with the idea of the League of Nations in the aftermath of World War I, it was President Woodrow Wilson's big pet project. He really wanted to push forward this idea of world peace and cooperation. America and the people of America did not join the League of Nations because it just wanted to focus on its own country rather than getting involved in European problems. America doesn't enter World War I until very close to the end in 1917. Not that they would have known then it was towards the end, but nonetheless. And the attitude was in America that they really didn't want to get involved in another European war, should there be one. So America turns to this idea of isolationism, just focusing on itself. And it's one of the reasons why America gets so rich and so wealthy during the 1920s is because it just focused on itself. And without getting involved in other people's problems, it was able to grow a really strong economy. This idea of isolationism and not wanting to get involved in Europe's problems continued through the 1930s, especially with the Great Depression. And America isn't alone in that. A lot of countries become very isolated during the 1930s and the Great Depression. They very much cut off their ties with other countries. It's one of the reasons why World War II happens, but I don't want to drift too far into that. But what we need to be aware of is when the war begins in Europe in September 1939, America is not interested in getting involved. So from March 1941, America supplied arms, as in weapons, not literally people's arms, food, medicine and other equipment to Britain, France, the USSR, which we now recognise as Russia, and China as well. So essentially, if you're fighting against the Nazis and the Japanese, we will support you, was the idea. Now, this supply of arms, food and medicine from America to these countries was known as Lend-Lease. So Lend-Lease worked on the understanding that America would lend these countries weapons, food and medicine on the promise that they would pay them back once the war was over. A real great example of American optimism there. Not only will the war be over, but we will be victorious and you will get to pay us back as well. So that is one way that America kind of took a step back, but actually Roosevelt, he felt really torn because he knew the American people weren't interested in getting involved in this war. But at the same time, his conscience knew how evil the Nazis were and everything that they were doing. They'd pretty much gone ignored throughout the 1930s because everybody was so wrapped up in their own problems. And he felt kind of bad that he wasn't able to help out his allies over in Britain, for instance. So Lend-Lease was almost a bit of a compromise in a way, and it meant that Roosevelt felt like he was doing his bit. Incidentally, I'm just going to chuck this in here. It's not actually a point on here, and I don't believe I mentioned it during our learning in this PowerPoint, but Roosevelt, technically speaking, should have been up for re-election around about 1940. And because of World War II going on, America entered a state of emergency and there was no presidential election. So Roosevelt carries on in the job, and he is one of the only American presidents to serve longer than his 2 terms in office. Just a little bit of additional info for you there. Under Lend-Lease, America shipped out $50 billion worth of materials. Now remember, we are talking about a time when America is still very much affected by the Great Depression. And this cash injection of $50 billion is going to make a huge difference. As we're going to get to when we start to understand America during World War II itself, the economic development that is able to happen during World War II solves a lot of the problems of the Great Depression. But we'll get into that as we continue with this PowerPoint. Oh, and I've just did it there. This level of production helped to stimulate the economy. All right, let's move on to look at America actually entering the Second World War. The images that you can see on the screen here depict the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The one on the bottom is a primary source. It is a photo taken at the time, and the top one there is a picture from the film Michael Bay movie. I was trying to think of the name of the director, Michael Bay movie, Pearl Harbor. If you've not seen Pearl Harbor, you are welcome to watch it if you like. Personally, I can't stand the film, but I will say that Michael Bay, who loves explosions, really kind of goes for it in the depiction of the actual bombing of Pearl Harbor. So if you don't want to sit through the schmaltzy storyline of the whole movie, feel free to search online on YouTube for the actual clip from the movie that shows the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because in fairness, it's pretty much where the entire budget for the movie went, and there's a lot of explosions going on there, so you can get a real sense of what it was like. Also, maybe watch it. You can watch it once if you want, and then watch it again once we've done a bit of our learning, because some of the learning, for instance, about the role of Black Americans during World War II can actually be seen in that clip as well. So the bombing of Pearl Harbor happens on the 7th of December 1941. Pearl Harbor was a naval base on one of the islands in Hawaii, Hawaii having relatively recently joined America as one of their states. And the Japanese at this time are allied with the Nazis. So this is the event that brings America into World War II. This is the point where they can't really sit back and follow this idea of isolationism anymore, because the war has been brought to American soil. And incidentally, this is the only time in the entire war that America as a country itself will be hit by the war. That's the only bombing of America that takes place. The way that they respond following the bombing of Pearl Harbor is that 10 million men were drafted into the army. Drafting is the same as conscription, being forced to fight in the army. And as it says here, by late 1942, all men aged 18 to 64, that's quite a high age group, much higher than what we were doing in Britain at this time, were required to register for the draft. And eventually 36 million men registered to fight. So this isn't volunteering. This isn't saying I'll fight for America, like you kind of see if you've ever seen like the early Captain America movies, for instance. Although there was a big recruitment drive and there were people volunteering, don't get me wrong, the majority of the soldiers from America who went out to fight in Europe were forced to do so. So they weren't professionally trained soldiers. Yes, they would receive some training, but it wasn't their first job whatsoever. These were normal, average, everyday citizens going out to fight in this war. Exactly the same as what was happening in our country as well, where we also did use conscription. But again, America referred to their conscription as the draft. On the home front in America, rationing and price control became part of everyday life, making sure there was enough food to go round. And again, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but a really great opportunity for farmers again here in World War II to be able to be producing food to both help the soldiers and having their rations, but also the people of America as well. We've got a lot of examples of people volunteering for jobs on the home front. Again, I said before, apart from the bombing of Pearl Harbor, America isn't hit by bombings or anything like that. But nonetheless, they still appointed air raid wardens just in case the bombings might happen. They were ready with sirens and shelters and so on and so forth. And you also had people volunteering to do first aid work as well for the Red Cross. And this is a phrase which you may well have heard of. We call it the concept of a total war, where everybody in society and all the resources of society are involved with fighting this war. We were definitely part of that in Britain. We were definitely an example of a country under total war. And Roosevelt referred to it as his arsenal of democracy, the idea that all Americans would be contributing in some way to the Second World War. Be you young or old, men or women, you would be helping America's efforts in the Second World War. So this is how America gets involved in the war. We've just talked previously about why they didn't want to get involved. And then from the 7th of December in 1941, they didn't really have much choice in the matter. And they very quickly had to get their country ready to fight in this war. We're next going to have a look at the role of Black Americans, and we're going to do that in two separate sections. We're going to start off by looking at Black Americans on the home front, and then we're going to have a look at them actually in the military themselves. That poster on the right-hand side is a great example of wartime propaganda that was really pushing out a lie there. United we win. This idea that Black and white Americans are working side by side to help America win this war. Now, don't get me wrong, Black and white Americans were working together. However, if it was as side by side and as friendly and cordially as that poster makes out, I strongly doubt. But we'll get more into that as we go through some key details. 2 million Black Americans worked in the war industry. 2 million Black Americans worked in the war industry. And by that we mean, for instance, making planes, making munitions and so on and so forth. And it probably doesn't surprise you at all to know they were often treated very poorly. Any wages they would have got would have been less than their white workers, and there was still lots of racism in the workplace as well. So despite that United we win poster that we just looked at there, lots of poor treatment for Black Americans in war industry. We have an example of a migration from the southern states to the north. You may remember the Great Migration from the 1920s, where we see a lot of Black Americans moving from the south to the north for work. And exactly the same thing happens again during World War II. Loads more opportunities. 400,000 Black Americans are able to take advantage of that. Now, to put that into a bit more context, if we go a tiny bit further back from World War II, in the 1930s, that kind of migration north would have really slowed down because the job opportunities just weren't there during the 1930s and during the Great Depression. So many Black Americans would have found themselves, well, pretty much stuck down in the South. World War II gives them the opportunity to move away for that employment. Loads more jobs available during World War II because of the war industry, not only with Lend-Lease, but especially when America gets involved in the war as well. To try and stop this from happening, this poor treatment of Black Americans in the workplace, Roosevelt ordered Executive Order 8802, which stopped discrimination in industrial and government jobs. And the idea was that if it was seen to be that your business or your company that was associated with the government were deemed to be treating Black Americans unfairly, or more so that they weren't employing Black Americans at all, they could see government money withdrawn from their companies. So it was, a bit of a threat, really. You either employ them or we're going to take the money away. And at a time when industry is still kind of getting back on its feet from the Great Depression, they still do need that government support. So in a way, their hand was forced. So they had to employ Black Americans. But again, that treatment that went on once they did have the jobs, that was another matter. One of the real boosts that we see going into the 1940s after World War II is finished in 1945 is that we see more and more people becoming interested in the campaign for civil rights. Membership of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured Peoples, increased during the war from 50,000 to 450,000 people. That is absolutely huge. An extra 400,000 people joining the NAACP. Now, the reason for that is, well, it's kind of twofold, really. Firstly, we have this idea that World War II very much brought to mind the treatment that minorities experienced in society, especially when the truth of the Holocaust came out as the war went on. Remember, people weren't really completely aware of what was going on in the Holocaust, especially not in America, but I don't want to get too bogged down in Holocaust theory and stuff like that. Because people are becoming more and more interested and knowledgeable in what was going on there, they started to look at the treatment of people in their own country. And one of the big things, and I hope we're going to talk about it in a second when we move on to look at the American military, I may well repeat myself ever so slightly, but a lot of Americans were thinking, why am I bothering fighting for someone else's freedom when I'm not even free in my own country? So it was a real boost to this campaign for civil rights with this increased membership. And when we get on to look at 1950s America, we're going to see how powerful that increased membership is going to be. So on the one hand, we have people who are seeing that they are more aware of trying to fight for people's rights because of the involvement in World War II. Also the involvement in World War II, a lot of Black soldiers, again, I'm hoping we'll talk about this again with the military, were stationed over in places like Great Britain where there wasn't any segregation. Now, don't get me wrong, there was still racism going on in Britain at this time, but Black Americans were able to look and see, hang on a second, there is another way for our society to work. So they came back from the war with all of these new ideas. A new civil rights group was also set up. The Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE, was set up in 1942 by a group of students. Now, student involvement in civil rights is going to become really important when we get into the 1960s. But this idea of the beginnings of the student involvement in non-violent protest can be seen with this group here. So CORE, that was set up in 1942, and they are going to go on to become part of many of the significant events to do with civil rights in the 1950s and the 1960s as well. Next, we're going to take a look at the role of the Black Americans during World War II in the military. We've got on the right-hand side probably the most famous group of Black American pilots during World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Tuskegee. I've always pronounced it Tuskegee personally, so I'm hoping that's correct. And we'll talk a little bit about these guys in a second. And then on the left there, we've got a propaganda poster about this guy here, Dory Miller, who was very much a hero of what happened during Pearl Harbor, where he manned a machine gun during the bombing itself that was attached to one of the ships in the naval yard. And he was rewarded, excuse me, I should say, as you can see from the medal that he's wearing there, for the contribution that he made and for going above and beyond the call of duty, as we can see on the poster as well. Let's learn a little bit more about the specifics of the American military's involvement, Black Americans' involvement in the military during World War II. Over 1 million Black Americans were either enlisted, which means volunteered, or were conscripted into the army in the form of the draft and formed what was known as the Jim Crow Army. At the beginning of America's involvement in World War II, Black Americans and white Americans were not fighting in the same battalions, but in segregated battalions. And that's why this phrase, Jim Crow Army, was used along with that. Within the armed forces, be it the Navy, the Air Force, or the Land Army, Black Americans performed really basic menial tasks. A lot of them, for instance, were cooks and would have been made to like peel potatoes and so on and so forth. And they also performed a lot of very dangerous jobs as well, the kind of jobs that the white Americans were unwilling to do. As well as that, they found promotion incredibly difficult and faced a lot of discrimination. And the Navy was probably the worst of the three sections of the armed forces with that in mind. A nice little statistic to back that up is that by the end of World War II, 58 Black American sailors had been promoted to the rank of officer. 58. To put that into context, for those of you who are currently studying with my good self, there are nearly twice that many taking GCSE history in our school alone. So that's a shockingly small statistic. 58 sailors were made promoted to the rank of officer during this time. Couple of key groups that we need to be aware of. The 761st Tank Battalion, which were nicknamed the Black Panthers. That name does very much directly go on to inspire the Black Panther movement of the 1960s. And as well as that, we have 600 Black Americans become pilots. And we have also from that the Tuskegee Airmen. We saw their photo just beforehand. And these two groups were both seen very positively. The Tuskegee Airmen never actually saw any direct combat. They were there as escorts for other fighter pilots and planes. So nonetheless, their role was very much seen positively by the wider American community during World War II. The aftermath of World War II sees a change in attitudes towards Black Americans in the armed forces. After seeing the contributions they make, General Eisenhower says that it would be a good idea to desegregate the armed forces. Now, General Eisenhower will go on to become President Eisenhower in the 1950s. So his idea and his attitudes about being in favour of desegregation in the armed forces and starting to actually look out for Black Americans is going to be really important when we see the changes he is able to make when he becomes president in the 1950s. Interestingly, although it was the most racist of the three armed forces, the Navy was the first area of the armed forces to desegregate in 1946. The armed forces of the Air Force and then the Land Army followed suit in 1948, all thanks to General Eisenhower's original idea. By 1955, the Army in America, be it Land Army, the Navy, or the Air Force, had changed from being one of the most segregated organisations in the country to the most successfully integrated. Integration is the opposite of segregation. So, although for the majority of World War II, Black Americans had a really tough time in the armed forces, in the long term, there were benefits from the role that they were able to maintain during World War II. Now we move on to look at women during World War II, and we recognise this poster. This is my personal hero. She is my history hero for sure, even though technically she didn't really exist. Her name is Rosie the Riveter, and this image has gone on in history to be one that promotes the ideas of the rights of women and power to women as well. It's a very common feminist icon. It was originally made during World War II to promote this idea of the contribution women were making in the home front in the factories. Now, Rosie the Riveter, as we see here, was a riveter, and a riveter is somebody who works on riveting pieces of metal together. If you imagine two sheets of metal and you've got those bumps that are there where the two sheets overlap with each other, that is a rivet. And those were most commonly used at this time on airplanes. Aircraft manufacture is one of the main places, as we're going to see, that women participated during the Second World War. The number of women in employment during the 1940s, or during World War II, I should say, excuse me, increased from 12 million in 1940, so before America gets involved in World War II, to 18.5 million in 1945. Thinking back, and hopefully, like I said, you've had a look at the 1930s video that I've put together. In the 1930s, the government was very much focused on getting men back into the workplace. But as soon as the draft is brought in when America enters World War II, much like here in Britain as well, we need jobs being done. And it is the women who are brought into the factories to do that. A lot of the new jobs that they did were in those traditional male occupations. They worked in shipyards, building boats, like we were just mentioning with Rosie the Riveter. There were aircraft factory workers as well. Nice little statistic for you here. 1 in 3 aircraft workers during World War II were women. And as would be traditionally expected, they also worked in munitions as well. So a lot of traditionally male jobs that women were fulfilling during World War II. This is one of my favourite statistics. I absolutely love this. So in a government survey that the American government did during World War II, 60% of American industry managers said that women were their best workers. What women wanted was an opportunity to prove that they were just as capable as men were when it came to jobs like this. And my gosh, did they prove it. 60% of American industry managers saying that women were their best workers. And as you know, if you've been taught by me before, I would usually say the other 40% were lying. But that's just my opinion. This is all well and good, despite the fact that they are being recognised for the contribution they are making and for how good they do their job. Women were still excluded from the highest well-paid jobs in industry. And we've still got that problem with unequal wages as well. 50 to 60% of the wage that men earned for doing exactly the same job. So we've still got this discrimination. We've still got this inequality in the workplace, despite them proving that they are just as good as men, if not better, at doing their jobs. And the real kind of nail in the coffin, if you will, was that when World War II was over, there was the expectation that they left their jobs and went back to being housewives and mothers. And many women were more than happy to do that. That was absolutely fine by them. But a lot of them had, for the first time, some of them, really got a taste of what it was like to be in the world of work and have your own wages. And a lot of women didn't want to give that up and were very, very unhappy when they were forced to do so. This is going to be important when we go on to look at women in the 1950s and into the 1960s as well. Much like how Black Americans see World War II as an opportunity to increase this idea of the campaign for civil rights, in the aftermath of World War II, women are becoming a lot more focused on their rights as well. We're going to have a look now at women's role in the military during World War II. And lots of comparisons here with the contribution that women made in Britain during World War II to the military as well. Queen Elizabeth II, for instance, took part in the Second World War as an ambulance driver, much against the advice and wishes of the royal family, but knowing that she was going to be leading the country within the next 10 years, around the time of World War II, she was very much of the attitude of, I cannot lead this country and not have said that I actually helped during our country's time of need. So she was very passionate about helping out and was an ambulance driver during the Second World War. More on that though, if you fancy researching into that, lots of details about that out there. But we're interested in the role of American women during World War II in the military. So we've got 300,000 women who served in the women's sections of the army. I'm going to go through what they were in just a second, but I just want to be clear that there was no conscription for women during World War II in America. So these 300,000 women were all volunteers, and they would have joined one of the following. We've got the Women's Army Corps, or the WACS, so that's the Women's Land Army. We also had the same in Britain as well, with the same name as well. There was also in America the Navy Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Services, or the WAVES. I love the fact that the Navy part for women was known as the WAVES. A nice easy one to remember, a nice visual with the sea and the waves and the Navy and everything like that. And in a more traditional role, the women also volunteered to join the nursing corps with the Red Cross as well. Now, just to be clear, these women would not have seen frontline service. The women in the WACS and the WAVES especially would have been involved more so in the supply chain potentially, but also in intelligence and in the nursing corps. Because we're not dealing with the same kind of warfare as we would recognise in World War I, they would have been stationed in hospitals a little bit further back from where the front lines actually were. Whereas during World War I, nurses would have actually been there out in the trenches and attending to men with that in mind. So all these 300,000 women, these are all volunteers. And it was very much the first time that women are able to participate in the military in America during World War II. They had never had this opportunity before. And again, like we were saying before with the role of women on the home front, it is a massive boost to the profile of women, again demonstrating that they are just as capable as men and that they are still contributing to the war, even through military roles as well as back on the home front too. And finally, we're going to move on to look at the end of the war and the benefits that America experienced from World War II. This photograph is quite a famous photograph. It was taken on VJ Day, which is in August. The war between America and Japan carried on for a couple of months after the war in Europe had finished between us and, for instance, Nazi Germany and the other fascist states like Italy. So this was taken in New York in Times Square, and it is, like I said, a very, very famous photograph. However, you may well know this already, but in case you didn't, this photograph is completely staged. These two people you can see there didn't even know each other. The photographer was there in Times Square kind of taking pictures of everybody celebrating the end of the war, and he said to this sailor, go and grab that girl and kiss her. And that's exactly where this photograph came from. So completely unsolicited and completely staged as well. But again, a very, very famous photograph. So famous, in fact, that in San Diego, in America, which is a significant port for the American Navy, there is a huge, absolutely massive statue. If I was only good at distance, I'd tell you how high it was, but you know, it's higher than your average building. Absolutely massive statue of these two individuals in this embrace here. And I remember when I went to see it, when I was in San Diego and I saw it, number one, I was confused. I was like, well, why is this here? Because the picture was taken in New York. And two, that's not actually a consensual picture of, sorry, a consensual embrace here. This is someone that's being forced into doing this. But anyway, that's a little bit of a did you know from history. Let's move on to look at the benefits that America experienced during World War II and because of World War II. So we have government kind of going back to an attitude that it had during the 1920s, where they were very much looking to the big titans of industry to help them understand how they could get America in a point where their industry was in the best position to produce for the war. So they set up the War Production Board, and these leading business owners were advising the government on what the country should do and the needs that would be there. Now, this is very different to New Deal in 1930s, where it was the other way around, where the government was telling business owners, this is what you need to do. Back in the 1920s, it was much like we're talking about here, where it was the leading industry individuals that were advising the government. So that comes back again during World War II. couple of businesses that are good to name drop in answers that were able to see a massive boost because of World War II. Coca-Cola and Wrigley's, the chewing gum company, they had their drinks and their gum put in the rations of American soldiers. So when they went abroad, they were able to kind of show these products to the people that they met. And there's lots of evidence of that, actually, of people actually coming into contact, like average everyday people coming into contact with this. My grandmother is one of them, where she used to frequently go out on dates with American GIs who would often show off all the exciting things that they would have brought with them from America, like chocolate and Coca-Cola and Wrigley's chewing gum and so on and so forth. Anyway, moving on. General Motors and Ford also changed their production methods to produce weapons during World War II as opposed to cars. It's a little bit similar. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but during this time of coronavirus, we have got car companies and companies like Dyson, for instance, that are moving towards making things like ventilators for the National Health Service. So that is not unusual that during a time of crisis, industry changes what it does, but uses expertise to be able to mass produce products like weaponry during a war. So these companies are good ones to name drop because they see a massive boost in their business because of the Second World War. Coca-Cola, for instance, becomes an international brand by the end of World War II. We talked about it a little bit earlier on, but thanks to Lend-Lease and also producing rations for the soldiers as well, American farmers were able to enjoy better times because more of their food is being exported out to Europe, much like they experienced also during World War I. As we will learn when we get on to look at the 1950s, however, they don't have to worry about the problems of overproduction when World War II is over, much like they did when World War I was over. But I'll talk more about that when we get into our PowerPoint looking at the 1950s in America. Again, hopefully you've seen the 1930s USA New Deal Roosevelt video that I put together. In that, I would have mentioned that although Roosevelt's New Deal did help to decrease unemployment numbers in America, it did not get rid of unemployment altogether. World War II is going to do that. Let's have a look through some of these statistics here. So 14 million people worked in the factories, 16 million men and women in the US Armed Forces as well. So here's two ways that we can see more and more people finding employment. And the war effort helped effectively to end unemployment. Here we go. Here's the statistics to demonstrate it. In 1939, 9.5 million people were unemployed. And by that, we mean people who were eligible to work, of working age. By 1944, that has gone down to 670,000 people. Now, you may well be thinking, well, that's still 670,000 people. But compared to the numbers they were dealing with, this is tiny. You're never going to have an unemployment record of 0. So 670,000 is a significant achievement. And again, it's all thanks to the Second World War. During World War II, wages increase. People's wages go up for the first time in a very long time. 1930s, times would have been really, really tight. So a wage increase would have been really, really exciting. But what's important is that their attitude towards money at this time was about saving their money and not spending it. A lot of them would have been growing up during the 1930s. These people, for instance, who were working for the first time in the factories would have lived through the Great Depression and would have seen how precious money was and how quickly it can be lost. So they were very keen on saving their money instead of spending it. One way that they chose to invest their money was through buying something called war bonds. And the way that war bonds worked was that the American government needed a bit of a cash injection to be able to help pay, for instance, for rations for the soldiers and so on. And they said, if you give us some money, if you buy a war bond, then when the war is over, we'll give you the money back plus interest as well. And the American people were very much in favour of this. And as we can see here, $129 billion was raised from the American people buying war bonds. And that's $129 billion, which is going back in the pockets of Americans when the war is over. And that's 1940s USA done and dusted. I hope you found that useful. I hope you found that helpful. I hope you found that interesting. As always, I hope you found yourself saying, yeah, I know this. I remember this, because you're right, you do know this and you do remember this, because this is exactly what you were taught in your lessons. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you can get updates when I post new videos. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter as well. You can find me at One History Help, and you can also find me on Facebook as well. Search for One History Help and you'll find my page there, which you can like and join, where I will be updating not only on Facebook but Twitter and Instagram as well when new videos go up, but also a few little bits and bobs of things that I find around that I feel will be helpful for revision. And especially on Instagram, which is at the moment where I have my most followers, that's where I'm going to be asking your opinions in terms of what videos would you like to see. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. I'm glad that you were able to join me for this video from One History Help on 1940s USA, and I'll see you next time. Bye.